Cold open, dust and rotors. The rotor wash flung grit into their eyes and snapped the edges of the yellow caution tape until it sounded like a flag in a storm. 4 security guards in neon shirts braced their shoulders against the helicopter's skids, pushing like they could shove the whole craft back into the sky. A rope swung loose from a cedar post where a man-mouth open in a half-shouted prayer was tied with 3 turns and a knot that didn't belong to this century. From inside the cockpit, a gloved hand reached for the throttle. The face behind the glass was shadowed by a brimmed hat. The guards didn't know who sat in the pilot's seat. They would soon. And the person running toward the scene hair wild, heart wilder. A history knotted to the pilots would carry in her chest a choice that had been waiting a decade. The moment snapped like a pin in a watch. Now, the story said, "Let me show you how we got here." Chapter 1. The map you can't fold back. Rowan Hall had been home for exactly 3 hours when the wind woke up, yanked every screen door in Dry Creek, and slung wildfire smoke across the valley like an old shirt on a bedpost. Summer in eastern Montana made that kind of noise. Coal trains in the night, frogs with big opinions, cottonwoods arguing with the moon. It had been 12 years since Rowan had listened to this ordinary music. 1 decade and change of medevac flights, underslung loads, and motel coffee that always tasted like it had been brewed in a cracked boot. He parked his pickup in front of the Harlanch house, killed the engine and let the stillness crawl into the cab. The place looked smaller than memory had left it. Paint faded. Porch swing missing 1 chain. He felt a tenderness for every flaw. A tenderness he tried to hide from himself. He would have walked to the door, except he saw her. Mara Ellison stood by the fence line in a denim jacket and a white shirt the wind couldn't make up its mind about. She had always carried her height like a secret. Long lines, soft voice, eyes that told you she saw farther down the road than you did. In high school, she'd been farmer strong and book smart, the kind of girl who quote-marked lyrics in margins and could haul a salt block without asking for help. She had been his once. In that way teenagers belong to each other, and to nobody at the same time. Their story still lived somewhere between the barn loft and the chute by the pond. "Rowan," she said, like she couldn't decide whether to hug him or hand him a bulletproof vest. "You came home. I heard you finally traded in that Camaro with the missing bumper," he said. "I outgrew it." She looked at his shoulders, the way 12 years had carved him into someone both familiar and a little dangerous. The way a county road maps out of town. "I heard you didn't outgrow helicopters. Some of us can't be trusted on the ground." He tried to keep it light, but she was not here for pleasantries. She gestured across the road, where a brand new sign declared, "Subdivision Phase 1 on the pasture he still thought of as theirs." "They started pad cutting this morning," Mara said. "Hector Lynn's outfit. Your dad signed the lease during his last hospital stay." She paused. "The fence line's wrong. They've come a good 10 yards onto the east pasture." Rowan's mouth went dry. "That easement isn't theirs. I told them," she said, and her voice thinned, then steadied. "They laughed at me." The old feeling rose fast, hot. It wasn't only anger. It was the memory of them at 17, shouting at a thunderhead for the joy of hearing it talk back. It was the day they traced their names on the frost of the barn window and swore they'd be braver than whatever the county threw at them. "Who's foreman?" he asked. "Hector's son. Avery. He thinks laws are just suggestions if you have enough capital." Rowan felt the familiar tug of the cockpit, the impulse to lift above trouble, watch it shrink. But Dry Creek had a way of demanding you stand exactly where your boots were. "You didn't drive out here just to warn me," he said. "No." Mara tucked hair behind one ear, a nervous habit that had learned to masquerade as composure. "You're flying for the state fire crews this season, right? On call." The subdivision's pushing into a wind corridor your dad managed around. If a fire runs through there, it'll pull like a bellows. We need someone who can talk both to the county board and the pilots. Someone they might listen to. And you think that's me? I think you're the only one who can straddle both worlds without falling. Smile was as sad as rain on an empty dance floor. And I think you still believe this land remembers you kindly. Rowan didn't answer. The truth was lodged like a pebble in his boot. He could feel its shape with every step. Chapter 2. The governor with the slow smile. 2 days later, the governor came to Dry Creek, which did not happen often. People wore their best hats and their best skepticism. The school gym smelled like varnish and ranch soap. A handful of state troopers hovered at the edges, trying to look both vigilant and like they belonged at bake sales. Governor Elise Hart was one of those leaders people didn't know quite where to place. She spoke like a school teacher and shot trap like an aunt you'd never bet against. She listened. She made notes. She asked for last names and used them twice to prove she'd hold on to them. Mara introduced. Rowan after the meeting broke into small circles of conversation. Rowan Harley, Governor Hart repeated. The medevac pilot from the Missoula fires? Some of them, he said, uncomfortable and oddly relieved to be recognized for anything other than the trouble his family name sometimes stirred up. I read the incident report, where you dropped the litter at the last second to avoid that gust, then circled back for the crew chief. You weren't supposed to be that calm, she said. I need to borrow your steady. Rowan smiled at the floor. The governor had a slow smile that told you she could keep a secret and make a promise in the same breath. He liked her immediately and worried about that. We've got a developer calling our bluff, Governor Hart said. The county wants to show teeth without getting bit. I want to see the lay of the land from the air before I make any commitments. She looked at Mara. He'll take me up. If he says yes, Mara said, pride and a tiny flicker of caution braided into her voice. Rowan's limbs filled with the yes before his mouth did. Flying had always been the easiest part. They set the time for Thursday dawn, when the wind usually minded its manners. Chapter 3 Sparks and Signatures Avery Lind was 26, handsome in the way magazines like their ranchers, and shameless in the way money sometimes behaves when it thinks it's wearing camouflage. He liked cameras and men who said yes on cue. He wore a leather belt he called a gift from a legislator he never managed to name. He also liked Mara Ellison, or more precisely, he liked the idea of owning a woman who refused to be owned. Don't worry, he said to her under the drone of a rented generator the day before the governor's flight. Once people see the model homes, they'll stop clinging to their myths. They're not clinging, Mara said. They're rooted. You say that like it's an insult to be a transplant. It isn't, she said. It's an insult to ignore the soil you've chosen. She nodded toward the new road cut. You've already ruined a wet meadow your environmental report didn't catch. He laughed without humor. I'll pave it and call it a community pond. You'll flood the lower hayfields if you do. He shrugged and looked over her head as if she were a caution sign. He planned to replace with one that better suited his aesthetic. The county commissioners have been generous with leeway. You should be too. Mara didn't tell him generosity is a river you don't dam without consequences. She just took photographs, measured distances, and made a note to tell Rowan what he'd already know. The wind corridor would turn a grass fire into a freight train if someone lit a match where Avery was standing. That evening, Mara drove to the old airstrip outside town. She watched the last light bruise itself behind the buttes. Rowan's yellow helicopter wore the dust like a history book. She put her palm on its skin and felt the memory of him along her arm. How quick he had always been to forgive a stubborn calf or a tired friend. How slowly he forgave himself. He stepped out of the hangar with a toolkit in one hand, saw her, and paused like the past had surprised him by still fitting. You shouldn't be here, he said gently. Not because I don't want you here. Because the Lind crew is out for blood and selfies. I brought you something, she said, and lifted a thermos of coffee. I remember how you like it. Sweet enough to hurt and strong enough to forgive. That's the one. They sat on overturned crates and talked the way tired people talk. Around the edges of big things, into the middles of small ones. He told her about Anchorage and the winter he thought would never end. She told him about nights the ranch creaked with the sound of somebody else's debt. They didn't touch. They didn't have to. The air did that for them. Rowan, she said finally, you left because you were called to fly. You stayed away because you were called to forget us. What are you called to now? He swallowed. To make room. For what's right. For what I ran from. For you if you'll let me. She turned her face toward the sound of coyotes tuning up in the distance. I never stopped letting you, she said. I just stopped expecting you to arrive. Chapter 4, Lift at Dawn. The light came clean. The way it does before it learns the day's mistakes. Governor Hart climbed into the front with the easy athleticism of a woman who had learned to trust her feet. She wore a field jacket and a ball cap, hair braided into a question that could be unbraided later. Her security detail stayed on the ground with radios and a very polite anxiety. Rowan ran through the checklist out loud. He always had. Ritual turned fear into a series of boxes done. 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 Go. Mara stood by the hangar, one hand lifted in a small wave that meant come home. And I'm fine if you don't. And I'm lying a little about that. They rose smooth. Dry Creek fell away like a story told in reverse. Fences arranged themselves into straight lines. Streams could be seen for what they were, silver threads pulling the whole valley taut. Governor Hart kept her eyes mostly forward, sometimes on the horizon, sometimes on Rowan's hands like they were a second horizon. What made you good at this? She asked over the headset. Bad ground made me leave it, he said. Wanting to return made me careful. They circled the subdivision cut. From above, the wrongness was obvious. A swath of scraped earth ran like a scar through grass that had never invited machines. Heavy equipment glittered like metal beetles. I see it, the governor said softly, almost to herself. I see the corridor. Rowan banked left to follow the wind's invisible path. He felt the mood flick in the air the way it does before summer storms and courtroom verdicts. On the ground, 5 pickup trucks in HOA green livery wheeled into the open lot by the main sign. Men in matching neon shirts spilled out with clipboards, phones, and the kind of swagger that had heard of authority and borrowed the jacket. Those boys aren't yours, are they? Governor Hart asked. No, Rowan said. They belong to somebody who likes to rent his power. They dropped to a high hover, safe and visible. The neon men waved arms and then waved phone cameras. One of them made a show of speaking into a radio and pointing them to land. Don't, Governor Hart said. Not yet. The man in the center drew his hand across his throat in a gesture straight out of a television show. He looked very pleased with himself. He had no idea who was inside. Let's put down across the fence, in the cleared hay, the governor said. I want them to have to walk to us. I want time to think. Rowan touched them down soft enough to shame a feather. The men came on like musicians who only knew one note and were determined to play it loud. They surrounded the helicopter in a half-moon of fluorescent indignation. Stay belted, Rowan said to the governor. She kept her headset on and her eyes steady. Let's see what they do when you're just a pilot. Chapter 5. The rope the men didn't know where to put their hands. One banged a palm against the plexiglass. Another took a selfie, his grin wide and tourists bright. A third bent to tie a rope around the skids where he found the loose end that had been used last night to moor the hello to a ground ring. Are they really The governor's voice had both wonder and disappointment in it. "Oh, for heaven's sake." Rowan gave her a side look. "You wanted to see their character. I wanted to believe they had some." Rowan flicked the external mic on and spoke through the little speaker on the belly. "Gentlemen," he said, "you're on private land. State flight craft with a guest aboard. Step back, and you can express your concerns to the county in about 40 minutes. You can even bring your clipboards." The man with the rope made a show of pulling it tighter. Another held his phone to the glass and filmed Rowan's face. As if on cue, a lifted pickup rolled up with a more expensive decal and a more expensive smile. Avery Lind stepped out like an apology the wind itself refused to carry. "You're off plan, Mr. Harley," he called. "This is an active site. You're spooking my crew." Rowan lifted his visor. He didn't bother to speak. The governor tapped his elbow. "Let me go first," she said. She released her buckle, opened the door, and stepped down into her own weather. The men fell back half a step in that unconscious way people do when their own story puts on a new pair of boots and writes itself. "Good morning," Governor Hart said. "I'm Elise. It's polite to ask names before you tie a knot on something that doesn't belong to you." Avery's mouth twitched. "Governor, we were just filming a violation," she said pleasantly. "You've got it backward." He tried to recover. "We're concerned about unauthorized landings and interference with site safety." A rumble sounded from somewhere out on the flats. For a heartbeat, Rowan thought it was thunder. Then the sound clarified into hooves. A small band of range horses, the last of the herd Rowan's father had loved like family, came at a trot, dust pluming. At their head, an old red roan moved with the dignity of someone who had earned every white hair. The guards turned to watch, their bodies opening like doors in that sliver of attention. Mara's F-150 slid through the side gate. She parked parallel to the rope, stepped out, and walked across the dirt like wind. She wore a bone-colored shirt rolled to the elbows and determination rolled to the sky. "Hey, Avery," she called, not loudly. "You're trespassing on the wrong side of history." It would have been funny if it hadn't been true. The next seconds bunched and broke quickly. One guard, still committed to his performance, tried to haul the rope tight, stumbled and fell backward. Another, surprised, yanked the opposite way and dragged the skid 3 inches. The rope bit Rowan's left foot like an insult you tried not to hear. And that was when the man tied to the cedar post in the lot next door called out, "Hold your horses." They all turned. The phrase was both cliché and perfect, because he was literally tied to a post the HOA crew's earlier attempt at dramatics for some social video, a stunt that looked sillier in the daylight than it must have in their heads. He wore a plaid shirt and a worker's grin. He was neither a hostage nor a saint. He was the county commissioner who had tried to appease everyone, and now found himself fastened to a problem he could neither ignore nor bless. "Untie me," he said, "because we're about to make fools of ourselves on television." The men hesitated in that skittering way cruelty often does when goodness clears its throat. Governor Hart didn't wait. She crossed the fence, sliced the rope with a pocket knife that looked like it had opened 100 stubborn packages, and handed the end to the man so he could make a show of undoing himself. Then she turned back, wiped her palms on her jeans, and looked at the horizon. A line of smoke lifted thin and curious from the direction of the cut meadow. Rowan's heart tripped. Then ran. Chapter 6 Fire finds the corridor. "Someone's burning slash," Mara said. "Or trying to. Or pretending to do a controlled burn without permission," Governor Hart added, voice level and low. She touched the mic at her collar. "Sierra to base. We've got a column on the east side of Dry Creek. Request wildland response. Air asset already on scene." "Copy, Sierra," the radio crackled. Rowan closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, the way you do when you've asked for grace, and it surprised you by arriving. He nodded at the governor. She nodded back. Let's do what we came to do, she said. They were inside and belted in moments later. The rope came off easier than it had gone on. The guards jumped back as the blades rose and the yellow machine leaped like it had been waiting for an excuse to be useful. Mara's gaze met Rowan's through the glass. In it, he read 100 sentences. Go, you stubborn, beautiful idiot. And, come back, you hear. And also, we weren't finished talking, and maybe we never will be, but go anyway. He set them into the wind corridor and felt it catch them like a river. Fire was small at first, grass and slash licking, testing, learning which dance steps it liked best. But wind is a teacher, and this corridor was a strict one. The flames found the groove the developers' machines had carved and ran it. Fast. Tankers. A 20 out, the radio said. You've got the sky. Copy, Rowan answered. He swung into a shallow angle and brought the belly bucket low over the irrigation pond that had always tasted like iron in July. The helicopter drank. He lifted, swung, opened. Water hissed like a blessing, and the fire flinched, then snarled. Governor Hart was steady next to him. She read the wind with the humility of someone who knows she isn't the main character in a story that includes lightning. There, she pointed. Break it on the left side. Make it choose. They worked in passes. Scoop, drop, gauge, adjust. On the ground, volunteer crews in borrowed yellow swung flappers and Pulaskis, beating edges into compliance. Avery's men neon bright, suddenly not important, stood in a cluster and watched like attendees at a physics lesson they had never learned to respect. The fire took the hint. It turned its hot face toward the scraped corridor and found the break Governor Hart had made. It slowed, stuttered, divided. When the first tanker roared overhead and stitched a red seam across the meadow, Rowan felt the whole valley breathe. He circled once more, dropped once more, and then set the helicopter down on the far side of the smoke where the wind carried the worst of it toward emptiness. They sat in the sudden quiet you always notice after rotor noise. The governor took off her cap and wiped her forehead with the back of one wrist like a ranch hand. Her eyes were bright, not with adrenaline, though that had its say, but with the relief that comes from seeing something arrive at the edge of disaster and step back. Mr. Harley, she said, you have a gift. I have debts, he countered, thinking of his father and the pasture, and the woman on the ground whose mouth had learned not to say stay. Those aren't mutually exclusive, she said softly. Help me make sure the people who start fires stop getting invited to the match store. Chapter 7. Aftermath and apologies. By late afternoon, the smoke had become story, thin and already remembering itself wrong. The county's statement trod carefully. The developer's statement trod carelessly. The town's gossip galloped. Governor Hart met with the crews, shook hands until her palm must have stung, promised what she could, refused to promise what she could not, and asked Rowan if he would sit in on the meeting with the Lynn Company the next morning. You're not required to be a hero twice in 2 days, she said. Heroes get statues and retired jerseys, he said. I get oil changes and a mortgage. He tilted his head. But I'll come. They ate supper at the lone cafe in town, the one that had changed owners 3 times but never changed the pie recipe, because the recipe had been carved into the floor of the universe. The governor surprised everyone by ordering the chili, and surprising no one by finishing it and the pie. Both Mara stepped in halfway through the meal, hair damp from a shower, sun touching the tops of her cheeks where she never remembered to reapply sunscreen. She slid into the booth opposite Rowan without asking if she could. She'd always been good at knowing when she was welcome. You flew like a prayer, she said simply. You drove like an answer, he returned. Governor Hart dug in her pocket, found $1 and slid it across to Mara with a grin. That was so sweet I had to pay a tax on it. Sit. Eat. Help me keep this man honest when he tells me the story of his life. Mara laughed. He edits out the part where he's soft. I noticed, the governor said, and her eyes softened the way people's eyes do when they decide to be true with each other. They talked about easements and tax districts, about school boards and the price of seed. They did not talk about the night 12 years ago when Rowan left without saying goodbye. And Mara learned that bitterness is a crop that reseeds itself if you don't mow. When the governor took a call outside, Mara folded a napkin into a triangle and unfolded it again. I should tell you something, she said. He braced without meaning to. When you left, I married Eli 2 years later. You don't know him. Good man. We wanted the same shape of quiet. He got sick. We fought for 2 years and then we lost for 1. She looked up before he could speak. I don't need your pity. I need you to know what kind of weather I've walked through. I can't fix weather, he said. But I can put a roof over your head while it storms. Her mouth tilted. That line would sound arrogant if you didn't say it like a prayer. I'm all out of arrogant, he said. I used it up in my 20s. And your 30s? I spent those asking for directions. They didn't touch. Again, they let the room hold the space between them. A boy at the counter tried to flip a quarter off his thumb and got a harsh lesson in gravity. The neon men 2 booths down ate burgers with the stunned politeness of people who had thought the day would end differently. Outside, a dog waited by a truck tire with patience only dogs possess. Governor Hart returned, clipped and weary and smiling regardless. Tomorrow's meeting moved up, she said. They want to control the narrative. We'll let them try. Chapter 8. The meeting that wasn't meant to bait. Conference room in the county building had been painted a color no chart, claimed something between oatmeal and good intentions. Avery Lind arrived with 2 lawyers who looked like they believed in their billing software more than in God. The county commissioners perched like sparrows on a fence after a hawk passes. Jittery, determined to appear dignified, ready to burst into flight at the first sign of teeth. Governor Hart listened the way mountains listen to wind. Avery talked the way wind talks when it doesn't know mountains aren't impressed. Governor, he said at last, we all played our part yesterday. Local heroism, civic responsibility. I'm glad it ended well. Now let's return to business. We've got permits to finalize. Governor Hart's slow smile did its patient work. You started a fire in a wind corridor and tied a county official to a post. Avery's lawyer, #1, spread his hands in a soothing gesture. There's no evidence tying our client. You filmed it, the governor said. From 3 angles. They blinked. Here's what we're going to do, she continued. Your project pauses. Environmental review reopens. The corridor gets protected. 500 feet on each side, no exceptions. You pay the volunteer crews over time and you'll enjoy it. You remove those barricades you stuck where they didn't belong and you apologize to Ms. Ellison for calling her the sheriff of vibes on your live stream. The room did the thing rooms do when someone has replaced the oxygen with honesty. Avery's lawyers recovered quickly because that's what lawyers do. They tried to argue about definitions of corridor and weasel space in contracts. The governor let them talk. When they wound down, she asked a question so ordinary it felt like a lit match tossed into a bucket. Do you believe your work will be remembered for adding to this place or taking away from it? They didn't answer. That was answer enough. Rowan did not speak. He listened to Mara breathe next to him and counted her inhales the way you check a heartbeat. Present. The meeting ended without signatures, which in politics can mean progress if you read the clouds right. On the way out, Avery caught Rowan's sleeve with a too friendly grip. You think you're the savior because you got here with a bucket before we did? He murmured. Rowan considered, then shook his head. I think I didn't run when the heat got loud. Try it sometime. Avery's smile slipped. You left this town once. It remembers. I came back, Rowan said. It remembers that too. Chapter 9. The night visit. That night, the wind changed. It came down from the Sweetgrass Hills, smelling like old stories and blown-out candles. Rowan lay awake in his father's room, the ceiling fan wobbling its steady rhythm above him, the window cracked to hear what could be heard. He felt the ache of the day and the ache of the decade between him and the boy he had been. He heard gravel crunch in the driveway. He sat up, quiet. The ranch never learned how to lie. It always told you who arrived. A shadow crossed the porch window. A gentle knock followed, knuckles respectful of sleeping houses. Rowan opened the door and found Governor Hart on the mat with 2 travel mugs and the look of a person trying not to admit she needed help. I know it's late, she said, and I know this isn't how governors behave, but I had to see with my own eyes where you came from. He stepped aside to let her in. She moved with that careful energy he recognized in firefighters after bad scenes and good rescues alike, the body's unwillingness to settle. They sat at his father's kitchen table, which had always known how to host confessions. She told him about the message she'd gotten after the meeting, an old friend of Avery's father, telling the story of another corridor, another deal, a pattern that wouldn't survive sunshine. And I told myself, Elise, you can handle this in the morning, she said, but my head wouldn't agree to the wait. She took a breath. You were there when the noise got big. So I came here. He understood. You go to the person who steadied the craft with you. Stay on the couch, he said. I'll take the chair that no one has ever forgiven for being sturdy. She smiled. You're kind. I'm practical. Kindness has to want it. She sipped what he assumed was tea from the travel mug. When we were over the fire, I watched your hands, she said softly. I noticed you never cinch a grip all the way. There's always a little mercy between your fingers and the controls. It looks like trust. In the air. In yourself. Too tight and you fight the machine, he said. Too loose and it doesn't know you're there. That ratio, she said, is leadership. He thought of Mara, asleep or not, in a house where silence had learned to be companion and not enemy. That ratio is love too, he said, surprising himself. The governor didn't flinch. Yes, she said simply. He gave her a blanket and left the hall light on, because old houses need a soft sun to remind them what they're for. He sat in the sturdy chair and thought about the way lives braid and unbraid, the way some nights arrive with new music in their pockets and leave it on your table. Just before he drifted off, he heard the coyotes tuning again. He thought they sounded like neighbors. Chapter 10. The morning that chose its people in the morning. Mara was on the porch steps with a bag of donuts and an entire weather map written on her face. You have a governor in your living room, she said, quietly. Yes. And you have something to tell me about yesterday. I didn't hear. Yes, he said again. And that was the best part about coming home. The handful of people who let you be unelaborate. They sat while the sun argued with the shade about where to sling itself. He told her about the night visit. She didn't bristle. She didn't pretend it didn't count. She simply nodded like a woman who had buried a husband and learned that jealousy is a luxury you can't afford when grief is expensive. Do you want to know what I want? She asked. Always. I want your life to be wide enough to include me in whatever this job asks of you. I want to stop bargaining with the horizon. He exhaled. I want to watch you plant tomatoes without apologizing to the frost. I want to build a fence we don't plan to sell. I want to grow old where the wind knows our first names. She leaned her shoulder into his. It was not theatrical. It was home. The screen door opened, and Governor Hart stepped out. Hair braided again, jacket on, ready. She took in what she saw: two people who had decided to be brave. She smiled the slow smile. "Morning," she said. "We've got work to do." They drove to the county building together. Three people who in some other story might have been rivals. Here, they were a team stitched by circumstance and the particular stubbornness of the West. The meeting was shorter than anyone expected. Avery's lawyers, faced with a whistleblower, folded. Avery himself tried anger, then charm, then resignation. Safeguards went into writing. The corridor got its protection. The volunteer crews got their checks. The commissioner made a tearful speech that wasn't terrible. Outside on the steps, Governor Hart shook Rowan's hand, then Mara's. "You two remind me what public work is for," she said. "It's for making room for people to live where they belong." She turned to Rowan. "I need a state aviation liaison who can translate between the sky and the ground. It's a traveling position. It won't make you rich. It will make you tired. But you'll sleep like you've done something that mattered." Rowan looked at Mara. He didn't say the question out loud. He didn't have to. "Say yes," she said. "I'll learn to love the sound of your boots returning." He said yes. Governor Hart clapped him on the shoulder like a coach, and then surprised both of them by hugging Mara. "Thank you for teaching me how to be polite and sharp at the same time," she whispered. "We need that." Mara laughed into the governor's jacket. "It's just farm girl magic. We use it on stubborn gates." Chapter 11. The Sky Learns a Name. The state job turned out to be something like what the governor promised, and something else like the first days after snowmelt. Messy, necessary, full of small triumphs. Rowan found himself in ranch kitchens and tribal council rooms, in city halls with microphones that whistled and school gyms with basketballs still rolling in the corners. He learned again and again the truth good pilots always know. Your job is to carry people where they need to go, and set them down without stealing their thunder. He came home on Fridays when he could. Mara learned to hear the thump of the rotors like another heartbeat in the house. She planted tomatoes and talked to them like family. She bought a new porch swing with both chains intact. Some evenings they ate grilled cheese on the steps and said very little. Other evenings they argued about the kind of dog they'd get and what to name it, and those arguments were their favorite. They did not rush toward marriage. They walked. The walking itself felt like vow enough. Dry Creek watched with the affection of a town that had seen bigger tragedies and smaller joys and knew the difference. Avery Lind left town 6 months later. His company rebranded and reappeared elsewhere under a different name. The corridor at Dry Creek stayed what it was. A ribbon of wind the grass loved, a pathfire respected. Governor Hart won re-election by more than anyone thought she would. She sent postcards from campaign stops with small notes on the back. "Tell Mara the coffee at the junction is still terrible. Tell the roan I remember his face. Tell yourself you're allowed to be happy." Rowan kept one of the postcards on the cockpit dash, under the plexi where the sun faded the ink just enough to make it feel like it was written yesterday forever. Chapter 12 returned to the post one spring afternoon, when the clouds were thin as paper, and the frogs sang like they had waited all winter to remind the world it could be decent again. Rowan and Mara drove out to the lot where the cedar post still stood. The rope was gone. The ground had healed in clumps and seams. "You ever think about the day you walked up on my helicopter, surrounded by men who thought they could move it?" Rowan asked. "I think about it the way you think about a scar," Mara said. "I touch it, honor how it got there, and keep walking." He took her hand, which had dirt under the nails and a ring he hadn't had to ask her to wear, because he had asked, and she had said yes in a voice like a creek after rain. "I never told you what it felt like inside," he said. "Tell me," she said. "It felt like coming home to a house where you'd left the lights on, and the door unlocked and nothing bad had happened while you were gone. It felt like the town had finally forgiven me, and more importantly, like I have forgiven myself." She rested her head against his arm. "You were always the one who could rise above it," she said, then added, "But I love you because you came back down." They stood there a while, watching the grass decide where to point. A hawk shouldered the air above them. A pickup rattled down the county road and waved the way people do when they recognize love even at a distance. "Do you ever miss the boy you were?" she asked. "Sometimes," he said. "But I like the man I am when I'm with you better." She smiled in that way that confirms an answer is the right one. "Let's go feed those tomatoes," she said, and they did. Epilogue. The part they didn't know years later. A reporter doing a long, slow story on wildfire mitigation came to Dry Creek and asked Rowan to walk him through the famous day with the helicopter and the rope. Rowan obliged. He told the part about the guard with the showy throat slash, and the governor's pocket knife and the water falling like hallelujah. He mentioned briefly the man tied to the post and the rooster that had crowed at the exact wrong moment and made everyone laugh. The reporter asked, "What did it feel like to be surrounded and not know how this would end?" Rowan thought about the cool headset against his ears, the governor's steady breath beside him, and the small wave Mara had lifted that told him all the words she couldn't fit in the moment. "It felt like being held accountable by the place that made me," he said. "And it felt like love had finally learned my name." That wasn't the quote the reporter used, but it was the truth. And at parties, when people asked Governor Hart for the secret to her surprising wins, she told the story of a pilot who left the ground gentle and set people down the same way, of a woman who measured a fence and a future, and of a town that learned to choose its corridor wisely. As for Dry Creek on summer evenings, when the wind combed the wheat just right, you could still hear the faint whir of a rotor mingling with frogs and the crackle of somebody's porch radio. It sounded like steadiness. It sounded like a map you couldn't fold back to how it looked before the journey. It sounded like two people who had learned to keep watch over a place and each other. And if you were there the day the new volunteer crew broke ground for a fire station named after nothing and no one, just Dry Creek Station, you might have noticed a yellow helicopter tilt its rotors just so, a small bow toward an ordinary miracle. They had surrounded it once, with no idea who was inside. Now they understood.